On behalf of our AISNE team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar will focus on competitive athletic programs in COVID. We will be recording this session today and welcome your questions throughout the hour using the chat window here in Zoom. Please feel free to post questions in the chat in one of two ways. You can post them publicly to everyone or privately to me. During Q&A and discussion, we also encourage you to use the blue hand raise feature that's a part of the participant pop-up window. We'll keep an eye on those blue raise hands and we'll be able to call on people to unmute at that time. We have designed this time together to share the expertise of today's panel while also allowing time for Q&A and discussion. I'm joined today by Mike Klingshirn, Director of Consulting Services with FusionCell, Matt Morrissey, Chief Operating Officer at FusionCell, Greg Schneider, Head of School, Belmont Hill School, and Joe Williams, Head of School, New Hampton School. Through a conversation with our panelists, we'll learn about the latest guidance from state, local, and national authorities regarding athletic activities and COVID-19, how to evaluate the risks and create a plan that works for students, coaches, and parents, how to adapt your plans as conditions change or as restrictions tighten or loosen. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Matt and our panelists, and thank you all again for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Betsy. So I want to walk through a little bit of the agenda for today first. We are going to talk in the front end a little bit about FusionCell to give you an idea of our background and frankly, how we ended up in the world of COVID consulting. It was an interesting story, I think. We will then talk a little bit about the specifics about COVID as a disease as it relates to athletics and the specific challenges that it poses. I'll thank Joe and Greg for giving time to us today. We're going to talk about some case studies, specifically on things that have happened Belmont Hill as well as New Hampton, and how they've addressed athletics specifically with COVID through the fall and as they roll into the winter. We will speak a little bit about some of the health and wellness initiatives in K-8 as well. And then we'll pivot back to talk a little bit more about the methodology and the lens that we've created that has been very helpful in looking at COVID, both on campuses as we roll into winter sports from the fall. And what I would like to just make clear, as Becky said, we do hope this to be a little bit more of a discussion versus just a presentation. So she's going to help guide where some of the questions might come in, and we may stop through different parts of the presentation to address some of those questions as we go, and also have the ability to speak to them when we get to the end as well through a Q&A. So we hope to be about 40 minutes through and then have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So from there, the question that I typically get very early with a lot of the schools that we worked with was, how long have you been doing COVID consulting? And my answer typically is since March, because before March, I didn't know what COVID was either. So a little bit of history on FusionCell. Our roots and our mission and vision has been on harnessing military and veteran talent and bringing it to the civilian workforce. And traditionally, it's been in the area of permanent placement and temporary staffing, and it still is a big part of what we do. Areas like cybersecurity, engineering, technician operations, logistics, the areas that are very akin to the military background. We've also always had a part of our business as consulting services, our specialty services. And again, frankly, prior to March, it was more in the areas of cybersecurity and physical security. But as happened with most of you, March, and specifically for me, March 17th was a very, a day I'm always going to remember, because it's the day that I think, especially across New England, I've said this and a lot of you have heard it before, you know, Tom Brady decided he wasn't coming back, the Dunkin' Donuts closed and the schools closed for the most part. So it was a very interesting day. Within our company, we knew that most of our clients were not going to continue to be hiring people for the next couple months for sure. Most of our organization is comprised of Air Force veterans. And I went to my recruiting team and said, are there specific skill sets and competencies that exist in the military right now that could be helpful in the civilian world? And the answer that day right away was yes, emergency management. And as a civilian, my first question back was, well, what's that? And they explained to me how every military base across every branch forever has had and still has a virus outbreak plan and a pandemic operation plan. And those plans are developed by their emergency managers. Not only are they for the domestic basis, but also when there have been issues abroad like Ebola, SARS, H1N1, these emergency managers are the ones who are deployed. So the background of these folks, and you'll meet one today, are board certified health officers that have backgrounds in epidemiology, pharmaceutical sciences, biology. So we started to collect and bring some of these folks together. And in the beginning, we went to a lot of businesses to say, have you put your COVID-19 task forces together? And a lot of them had started to. And the next question was, how many of them have experience with a pandemic? And the answer across the board was none. So we very early started, March, April, started working with companies mostly in helping them identify, if we want to get people back to work, what do we need to do? What should the plans look like? Where are the holes? What is the science telling us? How do we layer safety appropriately into our building so we can have confidence that A, it's as safe as possible, and B, that people have confidence to come back? That soon led to discussions with some schools, because a lot of schools were falling into that same area of, okay, obviously through the end of the year, this isn't something we're going to be able to get people back for, but we need to start thinking about the fall. So what we assembled through that period was, one, expertise, like I mentioned, board certified public health experts, epidemiologists, industrial hygiene, HR being the major focus areas. One thing that we did have outside of a lot of the other companies was, like I said, experience. These emergency managers are infectious disease control experts. They've been there, done that. They've worked with organizations like FEMA, Health and Human Services, the FDA, OSHA, so on and so forth. So we worked with organizations and then through the summer schools that already had plans, but we're looking for, are there holes in it? Or are there other areas we need to think about? Some of these were boarding schools, some of these were day schools. We worked through HR issues, we worked through facility issues. As we got closer to the start of school, a lot of those questions did start shifting towards, okay, now that we are on campus, in whatever capacity that is, what can we do now that we're here? Can we breathe health and wellness in some way, shape, or form back in, and specifically into athletics? So we spent a lot of time thinking through issues of fall sports schedules. And then obviously the last 4 weeks, the emphasis has been a lot more on winter sports, because going from outside to inside has some pretty big implications that need to be thought through as well. So that's the story of how Fusion Cell kind of got into this world. As you see, we've worked with a lot of schools that you'll be familiar with, a lot of schools that are on today. I see some familiar faces, so thank you for that. It's been everything from getting ready for this year, getting ready for the fall sports. As we move into winter, probably spring and beyond, there's still going to be implications. So just a little bit of the background from the Fusion Cell point. I'd like to introduce Mike Klingsheren. He's our Director of Consulting Services. He's going to tell you a little bit about his background, and then we're going to walk right into why COVID-19 is such a challenge, specifically when we're talking about sports.
Thanks, Matt. So my background is, well, it's up there. So my background is pharmaceutical sciences. As I was getting done with my bachelor's degree, I really thought hard about what I wanted to do with my life. So I went down the street to an Air Force recruiter, and he said, "Hey, do you want to be an epidemiologist?" I said, "Absolutely." So I figured out what that meant, and it turns out it was the best decision I ever made. I was pretty much born for it. So I went to the University of South Florida. I got my master's in public health. I got a graduate certificate in biostatistics. I have maintained my board certification for 10 years in public health, and then joined Big Blue. I spent 10 years active duty with the United States Air Force, and I just recently transitioned out. So in August of this year, I became a normal person just like everybody else. But since then, I started moonlighting with Fusion Cell, and we helped some schools, we helped an airport, some businesses get back on track with COVID planning. And so really I got to bring all the experience that I've had as a disease containment planner with the United States Air Force into the civilian market, and really bring some of those risk reduction tools that we've been developing over the past 10 years into the markets where they're needed. So that's me. and I am ready to talk COVID, and I hope you all are too. All right, so there are some challenges, and I think as we're approaching the winter sports season, we're going to focus more on winter sports. But some of the biggest challenges that are out there are the disease profile. So people tend to become infectious before they show signs and symptoms. So you have pre-symptomatic people, they're going to become infectious or become symptomatic. You have asymptomatic people who will never develop signs and symptoms of COVID. And so there's a 2-day period before those onset of symptoms or before their positive test where people can start spreading that disease. So you don't really know who is out there and who's infectious. So it helps build a environment where this disease can spread easily. As Matt said, March 17th was a big day. Everything shut down, but since then we have had 224 other days where we have reemphasized these health protection measures. So when you talk about complacency and fatigue, it's really playing a factor. And then as we have moved into October, the CDC has changed a couple definitions. They've increased their risk profile for indoor sports, specifically if there's poor ventilation and heavy breathing. So if you think about basketball, ice hockey, some of those other sports. So there is a potential for aerosolization, which is a little bit different than what we've been talking about for the past 6 months. But we're also getting into cold and flu season. And the difference this year is that cold and flu season has a potential to be even worse with COVID, even worse than it was last January, February, March, because now COVID is entrenched in our society. So we do have a bigger portion of people that are infectious, and there's people moving into indoor spaces, which changes your risk profile. And they're going to be moving indoor, they're going to be closer together, and you have the potential to spread. And so it's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. And a lot of the estimates out there is it's going to be pretty bad this year. So as we think about what we're told to do, you're getting information from your local health department, you're getting information from a conference, from your school districts, you're getting information from the state, from the national government, you're getting information from the World Health Organization. But really the focus there is that medical literature. Really, how is our understanding of the disease changing? Because it changes every day. And just because something changes doesn't mean the old way was bad. It just means that we have better information today and better interventions. One of the examples I have of this, buddy of mine from rugby way back in the day, he posted a thing that said, masks are ineffective. And if you click the link to the journal that it references, it's really more about people spending time in restaurants that do not have social distance. So there's fewer than 6 feet between tables and people aren't wearing masks. And so his takeaway was masks are not effective. That was the headline of the article. But it's really masks are not effective if you're in a high risk environment like a restaurant, and you're twice as likely to become COVID positive. So you also have state differences. As we talked about, you get information from everywhere, but every state interprets that data, those data points differently. And a good example of this is the risk assigned to different sports. So basketball in Massachusetts is a high-risk sport, but in Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, it's moderate risk. Ice hockey, high risk in Massachusetts, same thing. So moderate in Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut. As you talk about cheer, it's pretty high risk in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, but it's moderate in Maine. So everybody has different interpretations. But what I want to bring forward is you may be used to playing competitions across state boundaries. And as you get into the winter sports model, those competitions may look different, or they may not even be allowed. So there's got to be some way to kind of bring this all together and get to a place where schools can compete, or at least get those intramurals. And so my big disclaimer on this one is that we're not trying to push anybody into the athletic realm. Really, it's all about your comfort level as a school between the athletic director, the disease profile in your area, what the state allows. So some schools may only get to intramurals, and that might be their best option, and that is absolutely okay. But what we're going to talk about is some general concepts to help bring forward the ability to get to competitions between schools. And really, it's maintaining that integrity of the academic facility. So academics are always number one within a school. So that facility, that school, needs to show that even with challenges from COVID in the local area, that there's been no school-linked transmission within these walls. Once you have a good foundation within your school that can handle those challenges, you can start opening up to another layer of risk. And so that's where we start bringing in sports. But I do want to say that the assumption is not that sports are going to be disease-free or risk-free. There's always going to be a risk as long as there's community spread. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics has weighed in on the mask use during sports. And if a mask is going to pose a safety hazard or there's going to be vigorous activity, masks are sometimes not recommended. And so just keep that lens in perspective. Now that does not go for coaches, it doesn't go for game day officials, it doesn't go for spectators. Those are still universally masked, whether you're indoors or outdoors. All right, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so we're gonna kind of pivot a little bit to talk about some of the experiences of the other panelists, Joe, as well as Greg. We're gonna talk a little bit, like we said, about K-8 first, and then walk into some of the things that Belmont Hill and New Hampton have found success with as they move through the fall and into the winter.
All right, I think I'm up. Hopefully you can hear me. Matt, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being on the call with us today. I'm Greg Schneider. I'll start by saying I had the honor of doing a great tour of duty on the AISNE board. I want to thank Claire and Becky for all that AISNE has been doing for us. I think if there's a headline that will come from me today is sort of beyond, the safety guidelines, which are complex, trying to find ways in which this new paradigm can connect to the mission and values of your school when you think about athletics, I think is also critical. In addition to my role at Belmont Hill, I happen to be a proud parent of 3 daughters at Belmont Day, which is a K-8 right down the street. I know a couple of those folks are on the call today. And while I'm not an expert in managing the K-8 piece, I do have the experience as a parent and was provided with some great information by Brendan Largay, head of Belmont Day, a little bit about sort of their thinking around this. And I know we have K-8 people on the calls. So just some comments about the K-8 experience. I think for those that are really managing lower schools, in general, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on cohorts and podding, and that being kind of a critical aspect of the plan, which I think is much harder to accomplish for those of us with older students. Certainly at Belmont Day, students are in strict pods, but there's generally, I think, traditional program for the younger guys around, recess and things like that with slight modifications and hygiene protocols that you would expect. I have 2 daughters in the middle school program there, grades 6 through 8. And there, I think the pods are a little bit bigger based on grade size, but the athletes are not allowed to mix with other grades. And they've moved away from sort of traditional fall sports and interscholastic competition and have actually sort of transformed their offerings into these categories of training camp, running club, and outdoor adventures. My daughters are involved in the training camp, which offers, sport-specific training, but clearly in a different paradigm than normal. So I think a lot of what I'll talk about with older kids in terms of masking and hand hygiene, all of that applies, but some of the issues related to younger kids are obviously different in terms of supervision and the amount of recess and things like that are happening on campuses. I think I'll flip now to the Belmont Hill slide and just say a little bit about us. We are a boys' school, primarily a day school, grades 7 through 12. We have 22 5-day boarders at the moment. Our middle school is defined as grades 7 through 9, and our high school is upper school, grades 10 through 12. And as it says here, our mission is focused on developing men of good character, and our motto is working together. And I would say both of those things have been highlighted in the pandemic in new ways. We have a 3-season athletic requirement typically for our students, and a particularly deep adherence to a teacher-coach model culturally. So certainly jobs have been impacted dramatically by this new paradigm, and it's all hands on deck for sure. We're lucky to have a strong financial model that I think has allowed us to be pretty decisive in making our choices along the way. And I just thought I'd give a minute or two about our process and our connection to Fusion Cell before offering a couple comments on our athletic model. I think like most schools, we prepared multiple models over the summer. We began thinking about it in May. Bringing Fusion Cell on board was incredibly helpful, sorting through all of those various guidelines that Mike referenced to bring some credibility to our process, to build some consensus in our admin team. We first heard about them through Derryfield and Mary Carter, who I know is on this call. Then I had a chance to recommend them to Joe over at New Hampton as well. We also used resources at Boston Children's with our protocols. And so far, we've had a small number of cases at Belmont Hill, but we have seen no evidence of transmission. And we feel really good that our protocols are working. Our kids are on campus 4 days a week. Wednesdays are a remote day. We do have a full 6 feet of distance everywhere on campus, universal 3-ply masking, in addition to all the hand hygiene protocols. And we've re-engineered our schedule fully. We concluded early that downtime and unsupervised time were going to be sort of the enemy of the pandemic. And obviously we reviewed lunch and HVAC in a very comprehensive way. We are testing once a week on campus. We test all of our adults, all of our boarders, and a percentage of our student body. Maybe some of the heads out there can identify with this. I do feel like my job has basically become the minister of no fun, and spend my time getting kids to separate, to pull those masks up, and anytime there's something that sounds like joy, my vigilance goes up. So it's a hard time to lead in that regard. A couple of things that I think are worth saying. Number one, I think we have no illusion of a bubble at Belmont Hill as a day school. I know boarding schools and day schools think about that issue differently. Even though we have a small boarding population, they're going home on the weekends, and we know our kids have exposure risks every time they leave our campus. We can really only control what's happening on our campus. We also know that we have kids participating in town and club sports, and we have a lot of worry about that. We basically believe what we can offer on campus often will have stronger safety protocols than what kids are experiencing elsewhere. So we're trying to do as much as we can with that in mind. On the club sport issue, we have come down pretty strongly with parents and partnering with us. And we've delineated using the state definitions between tournaments and games. And kids who are playing in tournaments of any kind or traveling to states that are problematic absolutely are going remote, quarantining and testing. And we've been really pleased with the partnership. We've made it clear that some families and some students need to do that for reasons that are legitimate. And it doesn't make them bad people, but we want them to do it the right way. And that culture of trust has really mattered. And I won't suggest that it's all been perfect, but by and large, I think we've been really pleased with that sense of partnership at our school. We also made a pretty major investment in remote technology in our classrooms, which has made it easier for kids to go remote when they need to. We have 9 teachers who are teaching remote, and so we're set up with that infrastructure. But obviously that led to our hiring a pretty large number of younger teachers to assist with that challenge. And I think one ancillary benefit has been the assistance we've had with our athletic program through that group of people. Switching to our sports model, we started sports a few weeks later into the year. We wanted to iron out the learning model first, and obviously that's our priority. Normally our kids divide during the day, and half of our school goes to sports and then the other half goes down. That was not possible given the realities of the pandemic. So we're offering athletics twice a week for our middle school, twice a week for the upper school. We're obviously remote on Wednesdays, and we have offered some additional Saturday programming as it has been possible throughout the fall. We've waived our athletic requirements, so everything is by choice, which is sort of unusual for us. I will say the participation numbers in the fall were staggering. I think we expected more people to opt out, and we really had just a small handful of boys who opted not to be a part of our program. Clearly, our community was craving the chance to do some activity. There's no locker room use of any kind. It required a major dress code change at our school in terms of what kids could wear, in terms of how we manage transition from the academic side to the athletic side. Some of the dynamics with both NEPSAC and the ISL, which some people on the call are familiar with, a big shift was allowing for out of season competition. Normally that's not allowed, certainly in the ISL. And we decided to take advantage of that, and we're actually offering more sports than we ever have. And we took the fall and we divided it into 2 sessions. We're now into session 2. The first session, we offered our boys a choice between fall and spring sports. So we offered football, soccer, cross country, lacrosse, baseball, crew, track, golf, and strength and conditioning. And now we're into session 2, which is the first moment where we've moved indoors. Basketball, hockey, and squash, strength and conditioning, in addition to the fall sports, football, soccer, cross country, and crew has continued because we have a separate facility for that as well. Obviously, many of you on the phone or on the call are aware the rink shutdown has thrown a curveball into that, and we're all adjusting on the fly to that. But I think in some ways we felt it's been helpful to have smaller groups of students inside for us to see what that looks and feels like before we contemplate what a winter season might look like for us. Everything is masked. The modifications are substantial. We produced another kind of mini return to school document with the help of Fusion Cell that sort of helped our parents see what were the modifications that were going to be required across all sports, and then what really varied by sport. A lot of sport specific training for our individual coaches. And recently we've just begun a couple of scrimmages with some of the other ISL day schools, which has been, I think, a source of joy for our boys, but it's really been at a very small level compared to what we've done in the past. We've only had 2 of those over the past 2 weekends. And as the pandemic changes around us, it'll be interesting to see what that looks like in the weeks ahead. I do want to say that the kind of shared partnership among the heads of school, the collaboration has been remarkable. We talk multiple times a week about shared safety protocols and how that all should look and feel. I think this is a time where all of us as heads have been collaborating more than normal. That's been a real positive, certainly for us at Belmont Hill. And then my last couple of comments looking out into the winter. We definitely do have space concerns, which I think all of you do. It may be the first time at Belmont Hill where we may not be able to offer a spot for every student who wants to be a part of our program. I think we're going to have our arms around that in the next few weeks. And sort of what do we do about that is a challenge for us. We certainly, I think we all have some sense of worry about heading inside, but we also feel incredibly grateful that we've been able to do as much as we have with on-campus learning as well as with athletics to date. For us, it obviously is one of the really important classrooms that we have at our school that allows us to deliver on this mission surrounding character. So certainly many thanks to Fusion Cell for their help in our process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Williams, who I think will talk a little bit more about the boarding environment.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to try not to duplicate some of the topics that Greg covered, and instead maybe add a little bit of color where we are a little bit different. From the outset, we recognized that athletics was central to our mission at New Hampton, and that we needed to find a way to offer the full program for our families to increase value and frankly, to increase retention. We also recognized that geographically, we were situated in a location in central New Hampshire that we could take advantage of. And the collaboration that Greg mentioned between schools that's never been stronger was essential for us. So the Lakes region heads began our conversations weekly in March, went to twice weekly, and there were some shared agreements that we were all willing to commit to that allowed us to find a path towards athletics. Those agreements were that none of our students would be allowed to participate in any club or off-season programs in the fall. that our boarding students would not be able to go home on weekends, and the parents would not be able to visit campus. So that sounds a little like prison, but it was a great opportunity for our students to be back on campus, which they desperately needed from both an academic and mental health standpoint. And as the fall has gone along, we have found ways to provide some parent visits because we did think that that was an important part of the program. As a group of schools, we agreed that we would take the month of September to ensure that our own campuses were healthy. And that meant that interscholastic sports began from a training standpoint. We knew that kids were relatively sedentary over the spring and summer, so we first wanted to make sure we got them back in shape. We did have them completely masked during their training, and all of this was outside. And we were committed to testing, which was a really important peace of mind component to our, not only our faculty, but to the students and the parents. And so we were testing our entire community every other week. And that has become part of our commitment to continued sports with Lakes Region, and we've moved to weekly testing. And we alternate the employees one week and all the students the next week. As a group of Lakes Region schools, we also agreed that we needed to limit the frequency of games. We play only on Saturdays, and we play only against one school, with half of the games home and half of the games away. We do not allow any spectators beyond the students and employees on the school campus that are hosting. We wrestled a lot with transportation and trying to follow CDC guidelines, and ultimately felt that since we were testing our students regularly and the travel distance was short, that we would be masked, we would fill the 14 passenger buses, and we would keep windows open. The heads and ADs in the Lakes Region schools have a weekly call to review how things are going, forecasting ahead to the winter. And then the ADs have a separate call prior to the game day to discuss the conditions on each campus and whether or not we go forward. And the heads do the same thing. We agreed that a school would not be eligible to play if you had any students in quarantine because of COVID exposure. And that has unfortunately ruled out a school or two, but for the most part, our testing has all been negative and we've been able to proceed. As Greg mentioned, NEPSAC changed its policies to allow coaches to work with teams out of season. That was also an important part of our return to school program, because if we were not going to allow students to play split season hockey or go to lacrosse showcases, we needed to provide those things on our campus. So we made a commitment to having our ice down as soon as students got back. And we have created with the Lakes Region a showcase schedule, if you will, where each out of season program has 3 Sundays where they would play. And those have been hockey and lacrosse. And this past weekend, we did have one basketball scrimmage, but basketball and hockey have not been things that we've necessarily gone into lightly. I think parents have missed the opportunity to be on the sidelines, to socialize with other parents. They obviously have missed the ability to see their kids play, and that's been hard, but all the schools have increased their live streaming capabilities so that we're offering more opportunities for parents to watch. As Greg said, he introduced me to Fusion Cell. That was an expensive round of golf for my school, but it did prove to be very wise in addressing the anxiety of our constituents. And then we turned to Fusion Cell to help us look specifically at basketball. And in a nutshell, while there are controls in terms of your facility and air filters and other protocols, the tough pill to swallow as we think about building communities on our campus is that in all likelihood, there will be no spectators at any of the indoor games. And that's a protocol that we've started to follow for both practices and also scrimmages. But again, we continue to beat the drum of small sacrifices in order to achieve the objective of allowing these kids to play. So I'm going to stop there, I think, so that we can move on and get to the questions. But thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And I do want to make the comment as well that we worked with both Belmont Hill, obviously, in New Hampton, and though, you know, you're both elite private schools in the Northeast, as you just heard, there couldn't have been more differences in regards to how they ultimately had to build their plan. And it took all those things into effect that we talked earlier about culture of the school, geography, the physical location that they had access to, their facilities, so on and so forth. So there's quite a few people on the phone that we've been through this with other schools, and each one of these turns out to be a very unique approach and plan, but it's based on some of the same 6 big concepts Michael talked a little bit about here. We're going to spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes talking through a couple of the things we've put into our lens, and then we'll go and have an opportunity to talk through some questions that people might have. You're on mute, Mike.
Thanks, Matt. As we
it's the most common phrase in the Zoom world. You're on mute.
I know, I'm on mute. So as we talk about some of those interventions that Joe mentioned, the biggest one when you're moving indoors is going to be your HVAC capabilities. And as Matt said, every school has different capabilities. They have different limitations, and building that right size plan becomes tricky, but there's ways to fit the pieces of the puzzle together to get to a lower risk situation. So increasing fresh air, increasing filter capability, all the standards are out there through ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. Then we move in and we usually talk about sanitation and disinfection. So what are you using, how often, and what is the dwell time or the kill time for COVID? And is it effective against COVID? I think is the most important question. And then we move into exclusion control, so making sure that health screenings are happening and they're happening frequently so that you have the healthiest population inside your building. So you have your safe buildings, you have your healthiest population, and then it's behavioral modifications. So getting to that 6-foot distance, keeping those masks on and on appropriately, and ensuring people are sanitizing their hands. As we talked about, just the 3 main lenses that we use are the safe building principle, the exclusion principle, so that you have that healthy population in there, and that it's not attributional, so that people can, if you are sick, you can stay home, you can go remote, you can do what you need to do, and then as you return back, the school's safer and everybody else is pretty happy with you because you haven't shut everything down. But then the behavioral controls, so those modifications to get to those distances, especially as you talk about return to school and sports, distancing is a little bit tough. There's mask requirements and then schedule. But there's also additional considerations for each sport on the next slide. And really what it boils down to are the risks. As Joe talked about, limiting spectators. COVID is a function of distance, duration, and density. So if you can control those 3 things, you have a pretty good shot at being successful. So that distance being 6 feet, the duration, according to the new CDC definitions, you have a 24-hour window of cumulative exposure within that 2 days prior to somebody having symptom onset or testing positive. But you know, you're building these students that are critical thinkers. So as you go through the risks, age is a benefit. As people become older, they can understand the why behind these interventions. But the secondary effect of that is that they can then choose if that why applies to them. So age can be a double-edged sword there. But then high risk, people at high risk for COVID complications. So people with those underlying health conditions, all of the guidance is pretty standardized that a health screening physical should happen before any sports participation. So that really goes back to those inclusion principles. So making sure that you have healthy people that are safe to play. And then as you talk about modifications or the safety measures, it's really trying to limit that intentional or unintentional close contact. There's a bunch of different states that have adopted rules for specific sports, and the sports may not look the same as they have traditionally. Additionally, the layout, so making sure groups have distance between them, and then if you can, take a phased approach. So start with something low risk, your skills and drills, and do a 2-week period where you build in a quarantine period and you assess if that risk has caused any school-based transmission. Then you peel back a layer and then you go to pods and make sure that the school can handle the challenges and so can the athletic team. And then you can go to full team competitions, and then you can go into those interleague competitions. So the key elements that you really want to focus on as you're building these winter sports plans, think of it as a funnel. So your funnel itself is going to be the building that people are going into. So making sure that that building is safe. So the engineering principles, the HVAC support. And then you bubble up some of those other principles. So you have those behavioral modifications, you have screening and exclusion. But then the big kicker here is going to be really around officials and game day officials, those folks that are coming in from outside of your bubble, which in some cases are the biggest risk. They may come from the same area, or they may come from a different state. And so making sure that they are screening and testing appropriately within the guidelines of your state is going to be critical. And it's going to help you give the best chance for success for any sports season. Another thing that's a great practice is to define the risk, either for the individual sport or how you are playing that sport. And so the risk, Matt, if you can go to the next slide.
Yep.
Really, it comes down to defining what the risk categories are, and then what is the left and right boundaries of where you can operate safely. So lower risk being a more conservative approach for officials or referees. If you can grab them from the same region, actually the lowest risk would be if you can grab them from your schools, because they've already been in that bubble. Your moderate risk would be from the same region, and then their highest risk would be whoever's available. Screening, the more you can screen, the better. It helps with that exclusion principle, and people's disease process may change throughout the day. So if you screen in the morning, you may still have an exposure on the team at the end of the school day. And then testing, if available. And so there's different ways to get to testing if your league requires it.
So we're gonna roll to questions now, and I think Becky has some that have come in. But the point of this last slide too, again, it's what I had mentioned earlier. The reports that we've developed for some of the different schools we work with is we don't tell you what to do. We take a look across the different decision categories, and we give you multiple options of what you could do. And that may depend on your school, your budget, your culture. It might depend on where the disease is at that given time in your region. And then it also may change. So ultimately what we've tried to work with the schools to do is to arm them with the expertise and the intelligence to be able to put good plans together. And I can honestly say, no, Mary's on the phone here, Greg, Joe, I'm pretty sure some of the folks from Bancroft I saw on as well. They can speak very well to athletics, and I think with confidence to their parents now, which was really important. Not just that we brought in a company and they helped us look at this, it's really to arm them and have them be able to speak a certain language that maybe they weren't as apt to speak before. So that's really one of the things that we really focus on when we work with some of the schools.
This is all so helpful. Thank you for the great information, and just having the breadth and depth of experience and expertise across the panel has been really interesting. We have a cluster of questions that come around indoor locker rooms, indoor spaces, and just wondering if you can speak to how you're recommending people handle both indoor locker room use and people from the outside wanting to rent indoor space, knowing that COVID has been a time where there have been some losses monetarily, and renting out space is often a place where schools are able to reclaim some of that money and capitalize on that need.
You want me to jump in there, Matt? I'll start, and maybe Joe has
you start. Yeah, sure.
As a follow-up. I will say they're both great questions. I can tell you our emphasis to this point has been really zero locker room use and trying to avoid it. And we looked at what it would look like to have all our kids change every day and use gyms and use different spaces. And we ultimately concluded, changing our dress code and our whole approach about how we walk down to sports was a better way to go. Obviously, as we start to think about the winter, that gets more complicated with kids putting on equipment and such, but we still intend pretty much to stay out of our locker rooms as much as we can. On the rental thing, I will say we're fortunate that we've been able to be really conservative on that. And essentially, we shut down all of our summer programming as well as our rental piece. And looking to the winter, very, very minimal. I think we're not looking at it personally for the kind of revenue piece as much as we do feel a little bit of obligation to try to be helpful to our local towns whose kids are also starving for some activity. I think it's all up in the air based on what's going on, with COVID at the moment. But our intent was to allow a little bit of rink use for one or two local towns, more for the youth sports support, but not for anything related, to revenue. But I appreciate schools can be in very different spots with that, and the demand for it is very high. There's no question that people are looking for spaces. But we've taken a pretty conservative approach on wanting to message we don't have outsiders in our spaces, and even some pretty strong protocols about those that do come, how we want them to come, and what spaces they'll use. But I'll turn it over to Joe to see what it looks like in New Hampshire.
Yeah, from a rental standpoint, we're not allowing anyone onto our campus, any outside groups. The bubbles are not perfect, but we felt that rentals was a clear violation. And going a step further, we're probably not going to allow any faculty or faculty children use of our rink this winter, which will be a killer to a lot of folks. From a locker room standpoint, we're actually taking the different approach. We really don't feel like we can cohort, and we didn't want to have a soccer team go to 6 different dorms afterwards, all sweaty and dirty. So we are actually requiring that they use the locker rooms so that we can have a coach there, get them in, get them out, and we can launder their practice gear in the athletic facility. We just felt that that was a wiser direction for us to go in.
Mike, what would the rental potentially require, or is it even a path that anyone should be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw it out there for the first time today and just say that it depends. So everything is going to be dependent on the school, on the space, and on the capabilities of the building. Let me start with locker rooms first. So locker rooms are a place where people tend to go, and there seems to be a lot of social interaction from my high school days. I remember what locker rooms were like and how long I would spend in there. And so if you think about the 3Ds, so distance, duration, and density, those are things that you want to limit. But locker rooms also have the other potential. And so as you increase the number of people showering, you can increase the relative humidity within those spaces. And if you get outside of a certain range, you have increased risk for COVID transmission between your population. So in Joe's case, they test frequently. They have pretty tight exclusion controls, and they have pretty good control over their bubble. And so that is a layer of risk that they're willing to take. And then as you focus on going back to the dorm rooms, it is definitely a little more challenging to think through the process. But for other schools, it may not be worth the risk to have showers. So maybe it's just you limit the number of people and you limit the time that they can spend in a locker room. So you can get to the right answer, but it's going to be dependent on the facility capabilities within that space. Now, for facility rentals, I would, if you're going to go down that path, I would make sure that it's very defined that it's only one rental at a time. It's not multiple teams playing, not for a tournament. So maybe one competition, but they have to have pretty tight exclusion control. You don't want to bring something into your environment. But for your facility, you want to make sure that it's capable of providing that safe environment as much as reasonably possible. And so you want to make sure that it's safe to be rented and that the people coming in, it's all the same principles that we've been talking about. So there's ways to get to it, but it really comes down to the building capabilities and how much you can limit the number of people within that space. And there might have to be pretty tight restrictions like no spectators games only and only officials. So just the people playing or coaching to get into that space.
Thanks so much for that. Greg, I'm thinking about the comment that you made about the strong partnership that has existed, so that even when quarantining does have to happen, people have been on board and have been sharing their travel plans and their tournament plans with you. And just want to put out to the group an additional question or follow-up question about travel sports, travel hockey, travel soccer, travel field hockey, where you're landing on that in relation to like a game and a tournament, and where do you draw the line? And what if someone is not in partnership? Have you run into any cases where other families are telling you about travel that's been taking place?
Yeah. I think we all predicted as heads in the summer that we would see that behavior, you know, of sort of being sent videos and such of what kids were doing. And it's hard, you know, because we've seen a little bit of it. And I think we're trying to balance the reality that we can only control our campus fully with also some pretty clear expectations about partnership. I'd like to tell you there's a perfect answer to that challenge. In our case, we feel strongly for our boys, for them, depending on what grade they're in particular, the issue of them being able to compete and its connection to their college process is a real thing for some families. And so we came out pretty early on to say, we appreciate that some people are going to need to do this. And that does make some other people in the community uncomfortable. We're going to ask that you do it the right way with us. And here's what that looks like. And that's kind of been our approach. I think we have fundamentally tried to say, it's a different thing to drive to New Hampshire for one game with your parents and come back in your car than it is to go to an event with multiple teams from multiple places with different levels of exposure. So that's how we've tried to do it. Do I think our compliance has been 100%? Probably not. Do I think that we've been heartened by the ways in which people have voluntarily been sharing their plans and asking permission rather than begging for forgiveness? I would say generally we've been pretty pleased with that energy. I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Yeah, for us, it's been safety in numbers, and that all of the Lakes Region schools have agreed that we would not allow our students. So parents that are comparing us to others, we're being consistent. There's also some guilt involved. We've told them that it would violate the school's ability to compete that weekend, so or whatever it might be. So we have not had any issues with students breaking that bubble. To Greg's point about recruitment and the college process, that definitely is real, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we could create those showcases for our kids. We're also live streaming practices and inter-squad scrimmages, so kids can create footage that they might send to a coach, or we can invite coaches to observe some of those inter-squad or exhibition events that we're holding.
Maybe just one more comment I'll make that I think should be stated is, I think for Joe and for me, this pandemic and around athletics, I think it has called into question issues of identities for schools. I mean, we happen to operate in a league that's essentially half day and half boarding. And so those issues are just so entirely different, as the models you can see between Belmont Hills and New Hamptons are quite different. In many ways, for me, it's been hardest to watch some of my peers who truly are hybrid operations, you know, in terms of day and boarding, and then having to make decisions around, do we go all in for the bubble concept, or do we essentially, some schools have said, you know, we're going to be a day school for now, you know, and not do the boarding thing. And so to Matt's earlier point, I think it's really important to remember there's not one right way to do this. And there are some principles that I think are common, but the variation to observe has been pretty, I think we've seen it in the college level too. There's a wide variation of approaches. So that's why it's been such an interesting leadership moment.
And I think to your point, Greg, if you keep those 6 principles of the big 6, like Mike was talking about, at the foundation of what your plan is built off of, you know, the beauty of it is, I think Greg said this early on, with a lack of one particular organization that is telling you what you need to do, you can see that as a problem, or you can see that as an opportunity. And I think the schools have handled this the best, have seen it as an opportunity to layer in the proper safety measures to really partner with their parents and their folks. And we've seen a lot of schools do that.
I think one of the real challenges that we're going to face is trying to put the genie back in the bottle next fall for these families and players that have really enjoyed being part of their spring team in the fall.
Can you say a little bit more to that, Joe? I'm not.
So, as an example, if you have a lacrosse first athlete who traditionally has had to wait all fall and all winter to get to their sport, and they could train individually, but now they're with their team, they're with their coach, they're feeling connected to a group earlier in their process. And I think it's going to be hard for us to tell families that, no, your child can't have that same experience next year.
Thanks for that additional explanation. Definitely makes sense. We have a couple more minutes, and we do have some questions that center around, is there a trend? Are you seeing across some of the schools that you're working with people who are starting their season either later or earlier, taking into consideration the 2 holiday time periods that fall during that time? And also, are you seeing some consistency with schools in terms of playing once per week and not more, or are you seeing it range and have variety?
I mean, I can say in our league, which is split day and boarding, we certainly are seeing a trend of more of the boarding schools not being excited, I think, to having, back and forth, multiple quarantines, more apt to be remote in the Thanksgiving to winter period, and frankly, more apt to potentially bring kids back later in January and then probably rethink spring break. I certainly don't want to say that's true for all, because I think all schools have a blend of day and boarding that they're trying to balance. I think most day schools are trying to stick closer to their regular schedule, but those are generalizations and there are exceptions to that for sure. But I can turn it to Fusion Cell as well for some more context.
So I think what we've absolutely seen that there is no standard across from the schools we work with. There's really 2 levers that they're using. Some are leaning more towards virtual as their tool for the holidays. Others are leaning more towards testing. And some are doing kind of a hybrid between the 2. And it will depend upon culture of your school. Like, they've embraced for the most part the fact that families are going to travel. Let's not try and stop that, obviously. Given that, also, different states have different restrictions. New Hampshire, for instance, you cannot test out of quarantine. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, Massachusetts, you can. So there are a lot of different factors that go into that. And we've seen probably every different way at this point.
Yeah, I will say we're taking the approach that there is going to be we are testing our entire community. Our current plan, which I think could change based on what's going on, is test everybody on the Monday after break, stay remote until those results come back, and then try to be up and running as fast as we can with on-campus learning, because we're trying to prioritize that time. But I've seen as many plans on this as there are schools so far.
Yeah. I bet.
Yep.
I think of just within our own family and the sports that are going on and the varied approaches. So I can only appreciate how many different plans you all have seen. One question that just came through is, can you talk a little bit to consistency around masking? Are you treating it differently for different sports? Are you treating it differently for outdoor sports versus indoor sports? And just thinking about the distance, duration, and density, when are you requiring masks?
Joe, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we are firm believers in masks in the classroom, around campus, even in the residence halls, but we have gone with a no mask requirement on the field of play. And that's come through medical advice. And that seems to be working for us. In the winter, the bubble shields for hockey are being looked at. We are playing football as well. We do have face shields and I can't remember what it's called, a splash guard or something like that. But none of it's perfect, but we felt that that was the healthiest way to go. And I think our families and our school believes in the science that we've communicated with them. And again, the reliability of our testing to verify that our kids are healthy.
And I would say maybe this is a Massachusetts, New Hampshire difference to a certain degree. I would say we're more universally masked, some small exceptions around crew at times. And there's protocols around when kids are allowed to drop their mask, even within the context of a soccer game, for example. I would just say it's a challenge to remain vigilant, and we're doubling down on those efforts now. But in general, I would say our masking is really universal with everything we're doing. And it's a challenge because sometimes you have to tell coaches you need to do less, rather than take the mask off, which isn't always what they want to hear. But that's the dynamic we're in.
And this one really speaks to that slide we had with all of the different organizations on it and their recommendations. Mike, you could probably speak to that around masks, right? Because you're getting a lot of different things from different folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So the scientific answer is if you are participating in vigorous activity, you can doff your mask. So that would be athletes on the field of play. But I would say that there's a big difference between sports and a big difference between athletic competitions and, say, recess. So a recess, you may have students that are not being as vigorous. A PE class, it might just be kickball. But if you're talking about competitive soccer, yeah, outdoor is a lower risk than indoor. But when you look at the contact times that people have, there's something to say about keeping a mask on, because you may not have time to throw the mask up as the play's coming your way, depending on what position you play. And so there's a wide spectrum based on states, based on local guidance, what you can and can't do. And so getting to the right answer sometimes involves digging deep into those conversations with local health departments, with the state, and with whatever organizations are governing that sport. But each sport has a different risk profile. Being indoors versus outdoors has a different risk profile. And then it's going to boil down to what are disease transmission rates within the local community that you're playing against or playing with, if it's intramurals. So there's a lot of leeway in what you can and can't do in some states, but really it's about risk reduction. And so if you were doing something with younger kids, it may be more appropriate to be masked on because they're less likely to be vigorously active. But if you're going into big competitions, if you're talking about hockey or wrestling or football, there's times where it poses a safety hazard as well. So there's variation in what people are doing, but it all revolves around science.
Thank you so much for all of this information. I'm noticing that we are a little past the hour and just wanted to thank people for staying on for the great follow-up questions. And one thing that I just want to do is thank all of the panelists for taking part today, as well as the attendees who carved out the time, and acknowledge that this is always changing and ever evolving, and we will continue to look forward to these discussions and to hearing the insights that you have from these partnerships. In the chat, there was mention of just Joe and others being ready and willing to connect. And I think that's something that AISNE has really seen from March until now, is just the great partnerships, one-on-one as well as group discussions. And we encourage those and will continue to foster those and commit to that. So thank you to everyone. And please feel free to put anything additional into the chat that you're hoping for follow-up. And we'll look forward to sharing out some additional webinars soon. And thanks so much to Fusion Cell today.